It's the most natural thing in the world for NATO summits, particularly one as consequential as a summit that has just concluded in Ankara, to be preceded by heightened expectations. Yet this anticipatory zeal is not always matched by the actual weight of the decisions taken. In Ankara, however, a number of major announcements were made. The Allies agreed to provide 70 billion euros in support for Ukraine, whilst Washington, most importantly, signalled its readiness to move forward with granting Ukraine a license to manufacture Patriot missiles. The question now is whether what some describe as a construction of a more European NATO can still remain firmly transatlantic in its essence. I'm Orkan Amashov, you're watching Context, and joining me now is David Biro, Senior Advisor, Research Lead at Lidovica Center for Turkic Studies from Budapest, Hungary. Mr. Biro, welcome to Context.
Thank you for this invitation.
First of all, I'd like to start our conversation in the context of the announcements made regarding Ukraine. We have separate sections. We have 70 billion euro commitment and pledge. We have the decision, or rather signal coming from the United States that Patriot missiles could be manufactured by Ukrainians themselves, making them contributors, not just the country that needs help from European countries and other countries. Ukrainian officials describe these commitments as being very concrete. How concrete are they, you think?
Thank you very much for this question. As we've seen that one of the key outcomes of this Ankara NATO summit was that highlighted that all these allies need to support this situation, what is happening still in Ukraine. That's why, for example, this support package is extremely important regarding this, because it's a message direct to the Ukrainian side that they can also work on that collaboration and cooperation with the NATO in the future. And it's also a direct message to Moscow that so the NATO is still there, NATO is behind that kind of collaboration, and all the participants, all the NATO members are focusing on the current situation, what is happening still in Ukraine. That's why, for example, this situation is getting stronger day by day when all the leaders, all the policymakers can sit together and they are focusing on the current issues, the current situations, especially what is happening in Ukraine and all over the Black Sea situation, Middle Eastern situation as well. That's why, for example, that kind of package is very, not just symbolic, but it's a direct message all the different parties.
And one of the most fundamental challenges for NATO countries, in particular in the context of this transatlantic rupture that many people are talking about, with US appearing to be less committed to the European security, do you think that, at least in terms of externally visible parameters, NATO managed to project an image of cohesion and unity?
Can be, yes, of course, but as I also read different analysis and also start to collect different informations regarding the European implication, for example, that kind of situation. For Europe, the Ankara summit reinforced two parallel trends, for example. The deeper dependence on NATO as the core security framework, and also growing pressure on European states to assume more responsibility financially, industrially, and also politically for their own defense. And this multi-year Ukraine support package is not only about helping a neighbor under attack. That's why I also mentioned that it's a clear message, because it's also about preventing a successful Russian revision of Europe's security order, which would directly affect Central Europe, the Western Balkans, for example, and also the Black Sea region. Moreover, for example, discussions are on the defense industry and the burden sharing point to the future, where European strategic autonomy will be meaningful only if it is grounded in real capabilities and also interoperable with NATO, rather than understood as a purely political slogan in Brussels. That's why, for example, that summit was extremely important regarding that question.
What do you make of the whole issue surrounding Greenland and President Donald Trump's statement that Greenland should be American? This issue attracted considerable attention, and President Trump's remarks on Greenland are incredibly important in that particular context. How do you evaluate the extent of this subject? Why US is consistently referring back to this matter, and how do you see its eventual culmination?
Well, it's still an ongoing situation regarding the US foreign policy vision, the Green Line question, which can be also in the focus in the next couple of months as well. But I'm 100% sure the pragmatic vision, all the allies can be putting in the top in the future and focusing the direct issues, the direct problems. Of course, if we are following the current US foreign policy doctrine or vision, we all understanding what they, for example, focusing on the Greenland issue. But we have partners in each other, in both sides, for example, from the US side and the European side. That's why, for example, the discussion, the dialogue, it's more important than the direct issues, for example, regarding the Greenland question. In summit, regarding the summit, the Ankara summit, the direct way, it's again, Russia-Ukraine war, the Middle East, the Black Sea situation, but of course the Greenland will be with us in the next couple of months indirectly in that kind of focus, but I am 100% sure they will solve this problem and the focus will be again in the Ukrainian situation and all the security issues around the world, and all the NATO members can collaborate, and also they will find the perfect solution in this kind of Greenland issue as well. But how can we do it? That's the real question, but I'm 100% sure President Trump and all the NATO members will find the perfect way that they can sit together and they can also find the perfect solution. How can they manage that situation, which will also benefit both parties?
How important is it for NATO to make sure it is sufficiently distanced from the developments taking place in and around Iran? Because Secretary General Marco Rutte effectively supported US retaliatory strikes against Iranian objects, saying that they were necessary. But simultaneously, of course, amongst many NATO countries, there is a degree of disagreement when it comes to the way US and Israel conducted themselves regarding Iran. Will it be a moment of particular sensitivity for NATO to appear supportive in relation to US, which is a major NATO country, but simultaneously actually make sure that NATO remains outside the realm of the conflict there?
Yeah, as I also mentioned previously, the dependency is extremely important. Together we are stronger. It's not just a slogan, but it's a reality that if we are focusing on the direct issues, the direct problems, regarding the Middle Eastern problems, the war in Ukraine, that will be the perfect way when we can work in the same vision and in the perfect solution regarding that question. If, for example, one NATO member have problem, of course, that's why, for example, they have the Secretary General, they have all that kind of possible collaboration forms and also debates where they can find the way of that kind of collaboration. If the US has its own vision, of course, every country are following their own foreign policy vision, but that's why, for example, we have intergovernmental, international organizations where they are collecting those members who are following the same visions. That's, for example, regarding in that kind of way of NATO, the security alliance. That's why, for example, all the parties are in the same situation, in the same collaboration, and that's why they need to understand each other's independent foreign policy, but they are also in the same club. They are also following the same way what, for example, the NATO's vision is that. And I hope that the US also will be directly in that kind of way in the future. And if, for example, they will also would like to directly focus on the Middle Eastern issues, they will do it in the future.
Very true. I'll come to the point about Middle East regarding bilateral arrangement between the United States and Turkey, which is incredibly important in terms of the wider order there, and also in terms of understanding the balance between Israel and Turkey, with the former having its concerns regarding the latest deal struck between Washington and Ankara. But allow me to go back to the question regarding Russia. But Russia has been identified for some considerable time as a long-term security threat to NATO at large. And if you focus on the language employed in this very declaration, do you see a qualitatively new stage sort of emerging slowly? Or do you think that fundamentally the spirit that has been there since February 2022, since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, is a dominating factor. What I want to clarify, basically, are we observing the continuation of the post-February 2022 period, or actually 2026 with US adopting its own policy regarding Ukraine, wherein European countries are unhappy with the way US treats this entire subject, actually led to the reality wherein Russia is being weakened in such a way that is not commensurate with the way pre-2025 NATO vision mandated it to be?
Yep, that's why, for example, Turkey's role is extremely important in this regional context. Because, for example, if holding the summit in Ankara was itself a message about Turkey's importance in the second largest army in the NATO, the Black Sea power, and also the key actor in the Middle East, and also the critical transit country in the European energy and trade. But in the recent years, Turkey has also demonstrated that it can be both a difficult partner and an indispensable one, mediating on issues like the Black Sea grain deal and also simultaneously pursuing an autonomous regional policy that NATO and the EU must factor in their planning. And also from the Central European point of view regarding this, including, for example, Hungary's as well, it is increasingly clear that any sustainable European security architecture has to involve both Turkey and Russia in some form of dialogue, even while firmly condemning Russia's aggression also and upholding Ukraine's sovereignty. That's why, for example, the mediation is extremely important regarding this question, and Turkey can be the door, can be the gate of that kind of deal as well in the future. That has also happened in the past.
As you yourself mentioned, a number of important things happened during this summit, on the margins of this summit. I mean, one of the notable outcomes of the summit was that President Donald Trump indicated that Washington is moving towards lifting sanctions and is prepared to revisit the question of F-35 fighter aircraft. I mean, just want to clarify, quite often, as I mentioned during my introduction, you have these expectations preceding summit, and then quite often they, as I mentioned earlier, the anticipatory zeal preceding it does not necessarily match the actual outcome. Do you think this particular sort of a linchpin, which is applicable to many aspects of different summits, is actually not related to what happened to Turkey? Turkey appears to have emerged considerably stronger, with certain guarantees, with an element of praise ascribed to it by President Donald Trump, and with Israel feeling increasingly unhappy. Do you believe this is a tangible outcome which will have long-term future?
It can be, of course, because again, we were witnessing that kind of situation where the leaders of the world sit together and start a discussion, bilateral field and also regarding in the different side events, bilateral field as well. If I'm asked, for example, about the role of the United States as the president of Donald Trump at this summit, I would underline that NATO remains fundamentally dependent on American capabilities, and it's not a question, but European allies now understand that they must contribute more and more credible. And the reported warm welcome from Turkey's leadership reflects both relief that the US remains engaged and also awareness that Washington will continue to demand higher defense spending and more equal burden and sharing from the European governments. And for example, for countries like Hungary, my country, this means that reaffirming commitments to defense, investment, allies cohesion, and of course, clear messaging on treaties such as Peter Magyar's statement on Russia's aggression are not merely symbolic, but necessarily to maintain credibility in Washington and, for example, Brussels alike.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. One more point regarding Turkey's perceptibly increased leverage and the relevance of that increase in leverage to the region here in the South Caucasus, to Azerbaijan in particular. Well, Turkey and Azerbaijan are allies, treaty-based allies, and they have between themselves Article 5 style protection related to mutual defense. Any attack against Azerbaijan is an attack against Turkey and vice versa. Turkey and Armenia have been pursuing normalization policy. Turkey is increasingly present in Georgia and so forth. So Turkey is very important in South Caucasus. And when we discussed the question, what will be the direct impact of Turkey emerging stronger from this summit, as long as this region is concerned? Two competing considerations have emerged. The first consideration was that, of course, naturally the region will benefit, because in this region we have many allies of Turkey, and with Armenia, Turkey pursuing normalization policy. But simultaneously, if the summit's outcome leads to more confrontation with Russia, this region, which has been navigating complex reality and trying to pursue the geopolitical balancing act, will find itself in a very confrontational atmosphere, which it will not like. Which sensibility or sentiment do you think seems to have prevailed as a result of the outcomes of the summit?
Regarding the South Caucasus, historically there are a couple of regional and great powers who are also interesting in that region. Of course, we have Russia, we have Turkey here, and of course we have Iran, the regional powers regarding the South Caucasus. And if there are a couple of questions or situation or task what is happening in the South Caucasus, sometimes great powers, as the United States, which is also focusing on the South Caucasus. That was a situation right after the peace negotiation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. If we are also mentioning a direct point, the Trump corridor, for example, or Zangezur corridor, which will be also the interest of the United States as well. That's why, for example, they had a meeting in the United States. And regarding the Turkish and Azerbaijani collaboration, that situation when Turkey is closer to NATO day by day is also a good point for Azerbaijan, for example, because Turkey and Azerbaijan is a close partner. All we know that the slogan, the Bir Millet İki Devlet. If Turkey has a chance to make collaboration with any other partners like Azerbaijan in the field of security and other security issues, Azerbaijan is always the great partner to make some collaboration or have some kind of military training together, which is also have happened in the past as well between the two countries. That's why, for example, different multilateral levels are also focusing on the security threats and security issues, especially, for example, the organization which also included Turkey and Azerbaijan, like the Organization of Turkic States. All the declarations, all the summit declarations regarding that kind of field, that also mentioning the security threats, the security challenges, not just in the Caucasus region, in Central Asia as well. That's why, for example, all the countries need a strong background regarding the national security background as well. And that's why if they have the capability, if they have the tool, if they have the vision, and if they have the allyship forces, they can also focus in the future to learn each other, to share the different informations between each other, what is possible, and make some military trainings practices, which can be also help in the future. How can you make a better situation in, for example, in the South Caucasus when, for example, a security issue is happening? That's why, for example, those partners, those allies are extremely important. We are close to each other, and they have the same vision. They have in the same problematic situation sometimes, somehow, and that's why, for example, they can also be in the same part regarding that, for example, a question. South Caucasus, that's why, for example, extremely important. We have also Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and all the countries are focusing that how can they make the better balance between each other. We have energy issues in the South Caucasus, which is also reaching Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. We have also transit corridors, transit routes, not just the Zangezur corridor. We have Baku-Tbilisi-Kars railway as well. That's why this South Caucasus issue is extremely important, not just for the regional partners, for the Western partners as well.
Thank you, Mr. David Biro, Senior Advisor, Research Lead at the Ludovic Center for Turkic Studies. I'm very grateful to you for this discussion and for going through this complex issue. We looked at a number of issues: Ukraine, Greenland, Iran, strategic autonomy of European countries, and we will try to pose and find an answer for the fundamental question: to what extent more European NATO will actually will eventually make transatlantic unity stronger? Because after all, US is a key player. US is not going to leave this union, this alliance, of course. Simultaneously, it was more European presence. Thank you. I'm so grateful to you for your time and for this brilliant answer you provided. Thank you. Well, Ankara summit has sought to demonstrate that NATO remains united in the face of mounting strategic challenges. Whether that unity proves durable will depend not only on military commitments, figures or defense spending, but on the alliance's ability to reconcile differing national priorities with an increasingly unpredictable international environment. And fundamental question to what extent more European NATO will make transatlantic unity even stronger is of course an open question. You've been watching Context. I'm Orkan Amashov, and see you very soon indeed.